Arya's training in Bravos is a bit puzzling. She sells shellfish for Brusco as Cat of the Canals, and begs as Blind Beth, all the while collecting information for the House of Black and White. Keep in mind, Brusco could certainly sell more shellfish simply by adding hot sauce, but this is not a money-making operation. It's spying. But why? Why does an Assassin's Guild care about the goings-on of a city and the political environment? Shouldn't they be more concerned with killing people? Well, let's assess the political situation of Bravos and Arya's place in it. Bravos seems to be broken down into two harbors. To the west, there's the poorer Ragman's Harbor, where many of the foreigners hang out, and to the north, there's the richer Purple Harbor, where the upper-class Bravosi spend their time. So right away, we see that there's a class difference in Bravos. The Faceless men seem to be spying on both the poor and the rich. Arya begins her spying career as Cat of the Canals. She lives with Brusco, a servant of the many-faced god, and Brusco's daughters sell seafood in the rich areas of town at the Purple Harbor and the Moon Pool. Arya, though, spends most of her time with the poorer class in the Ragman's Harbor. This kind of makes sense as Arya speaks the common tongue and Brusco's daughters speak Bravosi. One of Brusco's daughters meets a roof rat every night, supposedly to get felt up. However, this might just be Brusco's communication channel back to the House of Black and White. As Cat of the Canals, Arya frequents a brothel called the Happy Port, as its owner, Mary, always buys a dozen oysters every time she stops by. It seems very likely that Mary and many of the customers at the Happy Port work for the House of Black and White, as they begin to train Arya in various Faceless Man techniques. Red Rogo taught her how to hide a finger knife and slice a purse, and Cosimo the Conjurer taught her sleight of hand. Cosimo is the more suspicious one. He later shows up with Ina, a one-eyed whore from the Happy Port, at the play in the Mercy chapter. Since no one needs to take a prostitute on a date, let alone an unattractive one, I assume he was checking up on Arya. It should be noted that as Cat, Arya spends her time with the poorest of the poor of Bravos. Arya specifically says that the whores at the Happy Port are not attractive, except for maybe Lana. They serve the porters of Bravos. Unskilled labor like porting rarely pays well, so these are likely bargain whores. Especially Ina with her one eye and mustached Asadora. Now besides prostitutes and porters, Arya knows thieves, drunk and disgraced priests, some brothers who catch eels, some not-so-talented mummers, and Quill, a playwright. Cat of the Canals' friends aren't exactly the movers and shakers of the world. Now speaking of mummery, it's important to note that theater thrives in Bravos. The rich attend theaters like the Blue Lantern that have plays with classy-sounding names like The Lord of the Woeful Countenance, while the poor attend theaters like The Ship that have more vulgar plays like Seven Drunken Oarsmen. The Mercy chapter takes place in an unusual middle-class playhouse called The Gate. The Gate is close to the edge of the drowned town where the Purple Harbor begins, and close to the Ship, which is in the Ragman's Harbor. It's frequented by the merchant class, dyers and butchers and the like. It's a playhouse between the rich and the poor. And we will certainly get back to the Mercy chapter. Now from the titles of plays, we have a pretty clear idea how the upper class of Bravos feels about politics. Ferio Farrell, a relative of Sirio no doubt, wrote a play called The Wrath of the Dragon Lords. It contained a memorable speech by Prince Garin. Prince Garin is Garin the Great, the Roynish prince of Croyane, who stood up to the Dragon Lords and whose civilization was thoroughly punished. You may know his civilization better as the Sorrows, in which Tyrion passes through in A Dance with Dragons. If Garin is seen as a protagonist, we can surmise that Bravosi don't feel good about Old Valeria, a land of dragons and slavery. And sure enough, the Sea Lord is very much opposed to slavery. Slavery is banned in Bravos, and the Sea Lord seized a Lyseni slaver ship who is grabbing wildlings. Bravos even enforced their anti-slavery policy on Pentos a century ago, much to the displeasure of Pentashi like Illyrio, who specifically said that anti-slavery laws were absurd. On top of this, Bravosi traders are banned from trading in Slaver's Bay. The Bravosi don't seem too wild about dragons either. The issue is very touchy with the Bravosi banker Tycho Nestoris. Tycho even uses the title of Ferio Farrell's play, Wrath of the Dragon Lords, when speaking with John. He claims that Bravosi don't jape about dragons. This is an interesting comment, as earlier a suspicious Bravosi repeats a jape about a dragon in a White Harbor tavern with Davos. Davos runs into a Bravosi oarsman in a somber woolen jacket who says he ran into the captain of the Slow-Eyed Maid who refused to take Daenerys and her dragons. This whole exchange is completely weird, as the Slow-Eyed Maid didn't refuse Dany. It was too small of a ship. And it's the upper class of Bravos that wears somber colors. An oarsman would be dressed colorfully. Was an upperclassman pretending to be an oarsman? Or did Davos make a mistake? There are a lot of possibilities, especially with Tycho Nestoris' ships in the area around this time, but it seems certain that, at minimum, dragons are a serious issue on the radar of the Braavosi, or at least some Braavosi upper class like this supposed oarsman. However, this anti-dragon, anti-slavery sentiment is very Purple Harbor focused. The foreigners at the Ragman's Harbor may have a completely different opinion about politics, or at least slavery. The Volantines, Tyrashi, and Lyseni who frequent the harbor all practice slavery, and the temples of R'hllor in other cities buy slaves to fill their ranks. Which brings us to Arya's time spying as Blind Beth. As Beth, Arya is able to spy on a slightly richer class of people than as Cat of the Canals. She's still in the Ragman's Harbor, but now it's more of a middle-class focus. She leaves the Happy Port behind and starts frequenting other taverns and inns. The two taverns we hear about the most are Pinto's and the Green Eel. Pinto smells and is run by a former pirate, but it does fairly good business, and its clientele seem to be foreign sailors. Arya finds out that because of the chaos in Slaver's Bay, the price of slaves is rising. There are thousands of wildlings at Hardhome, and the Lyseni have caught on to the fact that wildlings can be a suitable alternative slave source. The Sea Lord has seized a damaged Lyseni ship, but more Lyseni are likely to come. So we find out that slavery is an issue they talk about in the Ragman's Harbor as well. Now a quick look at the map shows us that it's a long way from Hardhome to the nearest slave city of Tyrosh. Having Braavos as a stopping point would do much for the slave industry, at least until Slaver's Bay calms down. Now besides Pinto's, Blind Beth also spies at the Green Eel, which is a little fancier as it has a singer almost every night. Darian claims that it sometimes has captains and owners as its clientele, and he thinks it'll be a stepping stone to him singing in the Purple Harbor. Now while at the Green Eel, Arya again hears people talking about politics. The Sea Lord is sick and dying, and the customers think Tormo Frhagar will be the new Sea Lord. And that name, Tormo Frhagar, gives the kindly man some pause. So who the hell is Tormo Frhagar? I have no idea. But we know who he isn't. When Arya is Cat of the Canals, she passes the towers of the Prestanes and the Antarians. I imagine these are very important families in Braavos, if not the most important families. And sure enough, Ferrego Antarian is the current Sea Lord. We also hear that Moredo Prestane and Luco Prestane are both captains. The House of Black and White is clearly keeping a watch on Luco, and Arya reports back that an old bookseller is visiting Moredo's house when he's gone. The Patriarch Prestane shows up in the Mercy chapter. He's rich enough to have his own box, but Prestane is also really, really old. And that's really, really important information. Antarian is about to die, and Prestane is about to die, or at minimum, too old to take over. So two of the most powerful men, if not the most powerful men in Braavos, are about to be gone, and new powers are about to take over. So the status quo of Braavos is in jeopardy, a status quo that a number of people in Braavos likely want to change. So who cares? What does this all mean? Well, there are a few possibilities. Because we haven't heard anything about Tormo Frhagar, he might be outside of the status quo of Braavos. Perhaps he's pro-slavery, or supports one of our Targaryen causes out there. Or perhaps House Prestane is poised to take over, just not the Patriarch Prestane. Luco Prestane does do business with Tyrosh and could profit from the slave trade. Moredo Prestane's house is visited by a dealer of old books and scrolls when he's gone. Yes, perhaps his wife is having an affair, but then again, maybe one of his family members is interested in prophecy. Or perhaps the change in power has something to do with the Black Pearl and her scions. The kindly man was also interested in her, and she has Targaryen blood, and may feel kinship to one of the Targaryen causes. We really don't know the details, but three things seem very clear. 1. There's class, ethnic, and political differences between the two ports. 2. Slavery, and possibly dragons, is of great political importance. And 3. The status quo of Braavos is currently threatened. Great, but what does any of this have to do with Arya and the Faceless Men? Well, now let's talk about the Mercy chapter. In the Mercy chapter, Arya is performing at the Gate, a middle-class play hall that under unusual circumstances is hosting the upper class of Braavos and Harry Swift, a Lannister envoy. Now Harys needs to smooth things over with the Bank of Braavos to finance the Lannister war against Aegon Targaryen. Now Aegon's benefactor is Illyrio, a known slaver who is actively trying to obtain dragons. Slavery, dragons, and Targaryens. Illyrio seems to represent the ideals of old Valyria. The Braavosi status quo should find him absolutely repugnant, and by association they should hate the Aegon cause as well. So really, Harry Swift's mission should be smooth sailing. The Braavosi Bank should absolutely want to lend Swift money to finance his war against Illyrio's new Valyrian forces. But then comes along Arya. She screws everything up. She sees Raff the Sweetling and decides he needs to die. And she thinks the violence may very well ruin the Swift deal. And the Braavosi upper class are there to see this deal crumble. With the Lannister cause seen as hopeless, the Aegon cause may be seen as a bandwagon to jump on for many Braavosi. A pro-slavery, pro-dragon bandwagon. After all, many Braavosi keyholders who have shares in the Iron Bank would want to support the person who has the best chance of paying back the loan the Iron Bank gave to the Iron Throne. Arya may have changed things not only in Westeros, but in Braavos. Now this all seems to be very bad luck for Harry Swift and the Lannisters, and great luck for Aegon and Illyrio. But was it really luck? It seems awfully strange that Arya is working at the gate during the visit of Harry Swift. Perhaps she was just there learning to act, but she could have easily been employed at the ship, a theater that actually had a vacancy. Cosimo and Ina are suspiciously there, as if to check up on Arya, as is Quill. Why is Arya a fairly unstable trainee in such a vitally important place when she didn't need to be? It's as if the House of Black and White was up to something, as if they planned for Arya to kill Raff the Sweetling. But how is that possible? Well, let's go back to Arya's training. One thing that's important about Arya's training is that she keeps failing and yet keeps getting promoted. In Phase 1 of Arya's training, she begins at the House of Black and White doing chores. However, at night she whispers the names of those she will kill. Raff the Sweetling is naturally among these names. And the kindly man even asks Arya about her death list. Faceless men are not supposed to have an identity, and yet Arya and her personal sense of justice endure. And so later the kindly man tells Arya to get rid of her possessions. Arya leaves the House of Black and White and gets rid of everything except for Needle. Now the House of Black and White has already shown that they've been closely watching Arya, enough to know what she whispers at night. Arya would have been pretty conspicuous leaving the House of Black and White, and she even speaks aloud, "It's just a sword," and "You'll be safe here, no one will know where you are but me." It seems pretty darn likely that the House of Black and White knows that Arya didn't get rid of Needle. The kindly man then asks Arya to choose a name for her new identity. Arya chooses her mother's name, Cat, and anyone who knows anything about House Stark would know that this is her mother's name. So all in all, Arya failed miserably at becoming no one, and the House of Black and White should know this, and yet the House promotes her to Phase 2, Cat of the Canals. Now as Cat of the Canals, Arya is a pretty good information collector, but that's not what promotes her. Instead, the big event that affects her training is when she decides to kill the singer Darien. Arya once again shows that her identity endures, and so in return the House of Black and White blinds her. Now at first this seems like a punishment, but soon we find out that blindness is just another step in the training. There's another blind acolyte, and the kindly man says they would have blinded her eventually anyway. So this wasn't a punishment, they were promoting her to Phase 3 of her training. And yet this is done after she completely and utterly failed to suppress her identity. Now we'll talk about Arya's time as Blind Beth some more in a future video, but let's power ahead to her time as the Ugly Little Girl. In the Ugly Little Girl chapter, the kindly man assigns Arya a target to kill. However, Arya hesitates. At first she tries to convince herself that the target deserves to die because he looks evil. Then she tries to convince herself that the target will welcome death. It's only after the kindly man tells her that the target is making bad on an insurance claim that Arya agrees to kill him. Once again, Arya has utterly failed to show that she is no one. Arya's sense of personal justice lingers. And although Arya's plan to kill the insurance salesman is clever, we actually have no idea if it worked. And neither does the kindly man, at least not at that moment. And yet he still promotes her to Phase 5, Mercy. So now let's put everything together here. Throughout Arya's training we see that she's a girl who retains her sense of self and her sense of personal justice. And the House of Black and White should know this. Her failure to dispose of Needle, the taking of the name Cat, the killing of Darien, her refusal to kill the insurance salesman without motive. They all show that she's failed to become no one. And of course Arya has a death list that the House of Black and White knows about. And then the House assigns Arya to be in a theater with Harry Swift and his entourage. An entourage that just so happens to contain a member of Arya's death list, Raff the Sweetling. It seems the House of Black and White knew exactly what would happen at the gate. Arya plus her death list plus Raff the Sweetling equals blood. But this means that the House of Black and White wanted the Swift deal to fall apart. But why? Well, we'll talk about the House of Black and White's motives and Jaqen H'ghar's mission in Westeros in Part 4.